Well, welcome, folks, as you come online here. We'll give this just a few minutes because it takes a minute to get everybody who's in the waiting room in. I'm seeing the participant count rise, so I'll just wait until that slows down here for just a moment, and then we'll get everybody started under the same banner. So just bear with us. I'll watch the attendee list here. So I see some of you coming in. Okay. And Kara Stewart, is that really you? I haven't seen you in forever and ever. And Brett, make sure that the chat box is enabled for the attendees as well.
We are good to go.
We're good to go on that one. Okay. We'll give it just another minute or two here, see if anybody else. Brett, can you see if anybody else is in the waiting room? I've got.
I do not see anybody else in the waiting room at the moment.
Okay, well, we'll go ahead and get started. There may be some folks join us. We are not sure what disaster preparedness conditions you guys are under. Many of you know probably the university has sent all of us at home at noon, but I have not gone home. I'm still here, but I do have, I don't have a background on. You're seeing my windows. So if somebody sees debris flying by my windows or something, just let me know so I can abandon ship and head to the basement. So welcome to, this is the third in our series of farm succession professional development, and glad to have you folks with us. We hope there's going to be some other folks joining in. Yeah, Tom Miller, you can let us know how things are in the West coming toward us. But at any rate, thank you for joining us. The first session, if you were with us, was Dr. Becky Smith, is that getting that? Yes, I got that right. From Mississippi State on heirs property, a topic that many of us weren't familiar with. 3 weeks ago, we had David Maris from Ohio State University on some family communications. David does a good job with this. And in our continuing series of bringing some folks in from outside the state that you guys don't get a chance to hear from very often, Kevin Ferguson is with us today from the University of Tennessee Extension Service. Kevin's based down at Murfreesboro, and Kevin and I go way back. Kevin was only 8 years old when we were in graduate school together in Knoxville many years ago, and we have known each other ever since. Know Kevin and his wife Phyllis. She was around at that time as well, so we go way back on a personal and professional basis. Kevin and I he's an area farm management specialist in Tennessee. He and I have worked a lot of the same areas. So over the years, we have shared information so profusely that we don't know who started it. Exactly. We just have stuff that I can't remember if it's mine or his, and it doesn't matter. We are the two leading practitioners of extension R&D. We rip off and duplicate from profusely with each other. So we will be, in terms of logistics, of course, we'll be watching the chat room. You can drop things into the chat. I don't know, Kevin, if you'll have anything you want them to drop in later on, but we'll be watching that and can Q&A. So if you need anything, just go ahead and pop that in, and we will let Kevin get underway. So Kevin, you're on.
Well, thanks, Steve. Good morning, everyone, and or good day, everyone. I will have to say, Steve maintained his not telling too many stories there. I will say that my wife a few years ago saw or read a description of where Steve and I were going to be speaking together on a program, and it mentioned decades of experience, and she got quite a bit of kick out of that. Just to give you a little bit of update, and yeah, you will see probably some slides that reference my good friend Steve Isaac. To give you a little bit of what we do here in Tennessee about transition planning or succession planning, we had an effort in that about probably 12 years ago called Farmland Legacy. And, you know, we got a grant and kind of made some efforts in that. But then probably about 2 years ago, we decided to revisit it. We updated a manual, and now, and you'll see in a little bit why there's more interest in it in Tennessee now. So we're doing both Farmland Legacy workshops. We're doing webinars. We're involving it in our Master Farm Manager Plan. I'll talk some about transition of management, but usually what I do when I go into these programs is I kind of give the 30,000 foot view. Let's look at everything that's kind of going on and kind of why we need to have an interest and see if we can encourage our farm families to start this discussion. So as Steve mentioned, I work as an extension specialist in farm management. I'm also our coordinator of our statewide managed program. We have 9 farm management specialists that work in that program across the state. But when we look at why, at least here in Tennessee, we got some interest in this in the past couple of years, the American Farmland Trust, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this organization, but I'm going to share with you some data, and it's actually pulled out Kentucky data to compare to Tennessee. But they put this out a couple of years ago that said the ownership of 40% of America's ag land will be in transition within the next 15 years. And that means, you know, somebody else is going to be making decisions on that land. But at the same time, they came up with a model. And they identified the nationally significant agricultural land, the acres that they call nationally significant ag land. They're the most productive acres of ag land we have in the country. They say that it's the land that we need to keep in production to make sure that we continue to feed the U.S. and feed the world. Well, it's interesting. Tennessee roughly had like 4.5 million acres of that nationally significant ag land. Kentucky, about over 5.5 million. So very similar somewhat. And you can expect to know where that's located, you know, concentrated in the Western Kentucky area. And I will tell you that I'm familiar with some of that area. I was actually born in Tompkinsville, Kentucky. So I'm very familiar with the Bowling Green, Glasgow, Cave City area through that time frame. But at the same time, when they looked at these nationally significant acres, they also came up with, and this study looked at land loss between 2001 and 2016. They actually then came up with an index and looked at the above average production land that we have in the state, in Kentucky, and in comparison in Tennessee. And then they looked at land loss. And that's what's depicted by the red. And you can tell the areas that we've lost agricultural land. And it's interesting that in Kentucky, they said we lost 131,000 acres of this high productive land, of which 119,000 were those nationally significant acres. I found it interesting in preparing for this presentation that in Tennessee, we're basically losing land, according to the American Farmland Trust, at about twice the rate as Kentucky. And we can have a good discussion of why that is, but we know we're really growing in terms of population in certain areas in Tennessee. But for most information we have, it's about double the rate of land loss in Tennessee that we're seeing in Kentucky. But when we look at Kentucky, things are really changing. I noticed going on my annual trip up the North American Livestock Show, what's going in there around Glendale. But also what's interesting is in Tennessee and Kentucky both, the land loss is going roughly 20% to commercial or urban highly developed, and about high 70 to 80% into houses, low density residential. Well, when I had this information first and showing it a couple of years ago, I started asking, you know, what would this look like if we could project the 2016 data now all the way to today's date or in the future? Well, Farmland Trust then, just this past summer, came out with their updated figures. They took the model that they had with land loss and they projected it for an additional 15 years or out to 2040. So they're saying by that time, Kentucky will lose an additional 450,000 acres of farmland. That's roughly 4% of the ag land. I will tell you that in Tennessee, that is estimated to be 8% of the ag land in Tennessee. Well, the one thing they did then is look at kind of the summary for each state. Kentucky was expected to lose 450,000 acres, 3,200 farms, 183 million in farm output, 7,600 jobs. 57% of the conversion was expected to occur on Kentucky's best land. Probably not surprising, Warren, Madison, Hardin County were the hardest hit counties. In Tennessee, it's Rutherford, Williamson, Sevier County, and East Tennessee. And you can actually go in to farms under threat and pull up the individual county data. I happened to pull Warren County up, and American Farmland Trust looked at some different scenarios. They said business as usual. If we just continue to kind of build in the same manner that we have and take farmland in the same manner, or runaway sprawl, we accelerate that. Well, in Warren County alone, by 2040, it was expected to lose 25,000 acres or be converted in business as usual scenario, and 35,000 acres roughly if we go to runaway sprawl. Well, one of the things they looked at, and then I'll show you, here's where I live in Rutherford County, Tennessee. They're saying that we could lose 40 to 50,000 acres if we continue to lose the land and the farmland the way it's been developed. And I ask the question a lot of time, what's the attractive land for development? And the other thing that's being involved here in Tennessee is looking at solar farms. But what kind of land is attractive for that development? Flat, deep soils, that highly productive farmland. I've not got it included for Kentucky because they didn't put it as a highly threatened state, but I will tell you that American Farmland Trust looked at the rate of loss for within that area or that county or that state, and then they looked to see if there's any policies in place to slow that down. And Tennessee initially came out ranked as the 4th most threatened state in the US to lose farmland. And in their recent update, they came to be the 3rd most threatened state in the US for loss of farmland. So you can imagine this got the attention of the Tennessee Department of Agriculture, Tennessee Farm Bureau. Farm Bureau has their policy development meetings held across the state. And the one thing that came out at every one of those meetings was concern over the loss of farmland in the state. Well, the one thing we've been challenged with at the Center for Farm Management is this information accurate? Is this information coming from American Farmland Trust accurate? We don't know the model they're using. We do know they're using data from the Soil Conservation Service, but we've been asked is, can we duplicate this? Are we sure we're losing farmland at this rate? So one of the projects we're looking at right now is develop a dashboard where that we go in and actually collect county data, and we're working with the Comptroller's Office, Tennessee aggregate data, as well as individual county property assessors to see if we can actually confirm that we're losing ag land at this rate. And what's interesting, we looked at early parcel counts, but we figured out pretty quickly that parcel counts are increasing. We're dividing larger acreage parcels into smaller acreage parcels. They're still in the green belt. So parcel numbers have increased. The average size of that parcel has decreased. So we're actually wanting to look at total acreage loss and individual acreage for parcels. We're actually going to try to collect some of that data. And if we can get the GIS data, it will be very helpful to us. We're going to try to collect that from some individual county property assessor's office next week. But this is one of the things behind our increased interest in succession planning. Another thing, Steve and I have already joked about it, we're not getting any younger. This is the average age of the principal farm operators by Ag Census. And what's very interesting, and we've tracked it back for years, the average age increases approximately 1 year for each census cycle. So from 2012, it was 58.3. It increased in 2017 to 59.4. We anticipate with the current census of ag for 2022, this is going to increase again. And you see the overall trend in the US, owners of the primary producers or the operators continue to get older and older. From the youth standpoint and the younger farmers, for every principal operator under 25, there's 27 that are over 75. So don't anticipate this changing a lot. Well, when you have that information, you can tend to get projections. And I look back and Ketchikova in 2010, and I think she may have been at UK at the time. She said over to the next decade, half of the farmers will retire and be replaced by beginning farmers. Well, and we just saw that American Farmland Trust said 40% of the ag land in the nation will be in transition within the next 15 years. Well, the one other thing I put in is what additional factors have influenced the rate of farmland changing ownership or being sold for development from that standpoint? And here I credit my good friend, Dr. Steve Isaacs. You know, has farmland been a good investment? Yes. You know, when we look at the change in real estate value, except for the Depression era, and except for the time period of the 1980s, the farm financial crisis of the 80s, and this is the reason that basically I'm working with a managed program. We started in 1986 after the devaluation, so you can see that farmland has been an excellent investment. We've got a lot of people that may have had marginal returns on their ag enterprises, but they built substantial net worth from owning the farmland. A lot of my beef cattle producers that I work with have seen this, and I've used this again for years. James Bennett was Sunbelt Farmer of the Year up in Virginia, managed the Red House Bull Test Station on 3 breeds of registered cattle. But he said, I firmly believe that adhering to tradition is the greatest obstacle to production agriculture. And I like to point out that, you know, this is not cultural traditions. When we go and visit a farm or you visit with a farm family and you ask them, why are you doing this now? Or why are you doing it this way? What's the response you often get sometimes? We've always done it this way. Grandparents did it this way. Dad done it this way. So a lot of ag production is tied to tradition. Well, is it tradition that we don't talk about transition or succession planning? And yes, and another shout out to Isaacs. For some of you that don't know, this is a picture on the farm in East Tennessee. That's young Ben that now has graduated from college and working, and Steve's dad. But, and I'll also say, Steve, they may not have seen this. I don't guess that's a flat field right there, knowing where you grew up in East Tennessee. But
that's a pretty good guess.
What's that?
That's a good guess. Yes.
That's
you can turn a tractor
guess.
over on that hill.
Yeah. Oh, I would. But think about going back to what we say. Tradition is a great obstacle. And we have, you know, a proud industry. You hear people talk about the home place, the 5th generation farm. In Tennessee, we have a program that recognizes century farms. We talk about 3 generations working together and farming together. But boy, we've got a poor job of accomplishing passing it on to the next generation. You know, and this is another thing I've used for a number of years. I never met Bill Whittle, extension agent in Virginia Tech, but I think I ran across this in a magazine, the top 11 pitfalls in farming. You could take each one of these topics and discuss them and have a session. You know, our lenders will tell us not planning or not knowing your cost of production can be a great pitfall. But couple of things I want to point out. No plan for transferring the farm to the next generation, not training the next generation. Yesterday morning, I was made a presentation to the Farmer Veteran Coalition of Tennessee. And it was interesting. They asked everyone to introduce themselves and why they wanted to be in farming. And 2 mentioned this same thing. How many times have you heard people say that they wanted to be in farming because they wanted to raise their children on a farm? You've heard some folks say, you know, what's the most important crop you're going to raise? and it's your children. I've heard people say a lot of times they wanted to raise those kids on the farm because they wanted to teach them a strong work ethic. But I want to ask you this, when did you hear anyone say that they wanted to train or teach their children how to manage that operation, how to manage the operation or how to manage a business? It's something that we just don't tend to talk about. We'll touch on some of the others. Dave Marison has touched on lack of communication, which is one of the main keys to this. Not managing your family living expenses is another thing that's all wrapped up in here. But I want to focus on this: no plans for transferring the farm to the next generation and not training the next generation. When we talk about succession planning, and we took this definition straight out of our Farmland Legacy Manual, a continuous process that involves transferring knowledge, skills, labor, management, control, and ownership between generations. And what I often point out to folks is that it really doesn't mention assets. They're assumed, but that's what usually consumes us when we're talking about dividing up property or something like that. But the one thing you really want to talk about is transferring knowledge. Transferring knowledge. What knowledge has not been transferred to the next generation? This is the other thing that a lot of people have a hard time figuring out. And the thing I think is kind of probably keeps us, a lot of farm families, from really getting a total succession plan. It is so involved. We have folks, and I've got a coworker that I shared a lot of the presentations with. He was with me last night in Wilson County to do a farmland legacy. He's our specialist in tax planning and estate planning. But that's only a small portion of succession planning. You know, we're talking about transition planning. We're talking about retirement planning for the older generation. There may be a future land use plan. But another thing that a lot of times is not covered, how are we going to transfer management? How about family goals? Is everyone on the same page? Do we all have the same family goals? Oh, how are we going to share labor and responsibility? Is there an exit strategy in case we do need to get out of this operation? So it's very involved in all the segments. Sometimes folks will focus just on one of these and not really look at everything involved with a succession planning. And that's the reason we'll talk about a team, a transition team. Well, here's one of the things I think that causes one of the greatest challenges. We've got a farm and we've got the siblings involved, and some of them view that farm that they want to keep it in the family no matter what happens. And we have other families involved, or family members involved, that have no desire, no goal to keep it in the family. All they see is how fast can we convert it to cash. And one of the challenges is the differences in those family goals definitely leads to stress. And I will tell you now, one of the things that's leading to stress in Middle Tennessee is the amount of money being offered currently for some of the land. I had a gentleman call me the other day. He's actually a neighbor of mine. He's got 25 acres, long road frontage, flat. The developers keep coming to him and they keep raising the offer, raising the price. And he told me, he said, my wife wants to sell the property. He said, none of the children are going to come back. But he said, this is my home farm and I'm struggling with this right now. And to share you another thing, and you know, I get back to the deal that this needs to be a family decision, because again, some of the offers that are being made here in Rutherford County, there's a farm that I've worked with that dates back to the very early 1800s. They've been very active, very productive, very diversified operation. The county, and it's been reported in the local newspaper, the county just offered them $80,000 an acre for 65 acres, plus a projected over $500,000 for the home to build 2 schools on. That's multi-generational wealth for that family. So it really, the situations we're encountering now can dramatically lead to stress. Well, what can be done about this? I understand that you're going to have Dr. Cole on later, and I hope that I don't use any of the things that he's going to put in, or I will say, ask him about these, but I copied this down from his business planning deal several years ago. 80% of Americans have no goals, 16% have goals in their mind, but never write them down, and 4% write them down and make 9 times more money. Now, I don't know if Dr. Cole and Dr. Steve Isaac could prove this or not, but I will say that once I saw this, I started writing down a few more goals. But the point is, think about how many people have a transition plan, and I'm going to share that with you in a little bit. And if you don't put down and have a goal to make a transition plan, traditionally, historically, we're not going to have one. And from that standpoint as well, how do you talk about those goals? When we have kind of workshops, when we bring in farm families, we actually like to have them fill out some information about their primary goals for their business and their family and lifestyle. But one key is we want them to separate, especially if you've got spouses there. Separate and fill out the information. Give you a true story. A number of years ago, when I was back in East Tennessee, a lot more dairies there at the time. A lot of dairies that really relied on family labor. And there was one dairy couple there. The young lady was, or the lady was someone that had been a city girl, married the farm guy. They were raising their family. And she was actually the very first one when we came back to say, would you read your goals about your family and your lifestyle for your operation? And she said, well, we're working way too much. I wish there was some way that we could stop dairying and spend more time with our family and make it economically and financially secure. Well, you're in a room full of dairy families. What was the reaction? Basically a gasp in the room. There's someone that wants to quit dairying and break her husband's tradition of being in the dairy business. We asked the husband to read his goals next. He said, I'm struggling with how much time I'm working on this dairy farm, and I wish that we could sell the cows and I could spend more time with my family. They had the exact same goal, but they had never communicated it and shared with each other. They actually transitioned out of dairying into some other ag enterprise. One family member got an off-farm job, totally changed their lifestyle, but they had not contributed or talked to each other in that great thing of communication. Well, and I know you've had Dave Marison on. He's one of the best at talking about family communication. I actually have, when I do a presentation in Tennessee, I have 2 or 3 of his slides in here. But here's the one thing I will add. Why do farm families struggle to communicate? One of the big challenges that we face as extension educators is how can we encourage those farm families to start the succession planning discussion earlier than what traditionally occurs? How can we get them to start this discussion in their 30s, 40s, maybe even 50s, as opposed to the 60s, 70s, 80s? Because there's a lot of other options and tools that are available to us if we will start during this time. And it's also a time period that they can start the discussion with their children. I think I was at the Young Dairy Conference in Kentucky, speaking on transition about 2014. Interesting, after I made the presentation at a break, a young couple came up to me. I think they were kind of unique. I think they had bought in and they were a first generation dairy farm family. But they had two small children, both preteen, I know. But the interesting thing that the wife said to me, said, we really appreciate what you said, we've already had a kind of a family discussion, and we want to talk to our kids as they're growing up and as they're working and participating in things on the farm. We want to try to teach them management, but we also want to try to see if they're interested in staying on the farm and the advantages to that, or their other goals and opportunities. They said, we think this is a discussion that needs to start now. And I applauded them for them. I've used that as an example a number of times through that. Well, here's the challenge. Not only is it farm families, look at the information from caring.com. Approximately 68% of adults in the US do not have a will. They don't even have a will. Most all of the information we see says it's 60% or above. The most recent from caring.com, 68%. So they don't even have a will. And I will share with this, a lot of the wills that are out there don't say a lot. Steve mentioned my wife. She's in the last 9 months, there's been 2 unexpected deaths in her family. Most recently was a cousin, 58 years old. Cousin Stan passed away. No children, never married. His 86-year-old mother found him, her only child. And then, yes, there was a will, but it was from 1998. And it actually, the only thing the will did was name his mother, who is 86, as the executor or executrix of his estate. So it's a real challenge. There was not a list of anything in terms of investments. My wife went with her aunt recently, basically to close some of the insurance on vehicles, and found out that there was life insurance policies that no one knew about. So just because someone does have a will, it may not be very helpful in selling an estate or transitions like that. But the other thing that we do in Master Farm Manager, we asked all of our participants up front, do you have a farm transition plan? And I've got listed here, you know, from 649 that went through in 20 and 21, but it's consistent. 15 to 16% is all that will indicate they have a transition plan. We just finished a webinar series on Master Farm Manager with 230 plus participants from across the state. That pre-program survey said 15% have a farm transition plan. And how I kind of shared that information with people then, and I've replaced my Tennessee data with Kentucky data. And I will say that our participants in this Master Farm Manager program are very reflective of Tennessee agriculture. We'll have the 1,000+ acres, several thousand acre row crop farms from West Tennessee, and we'll have someone that's got 5 beehives. So it's very reflective of the diversity of Tennessee agriculture. But from the 2017 Census of Ag, if we look at the value of land, buildings, machinery, and equipment in Kentucky, not counting livestock, crops held, supplies, etc., but land, buildings, machinery, and equipment was $55.1 billion. We know that's going to be tremendously higher in this new Census of Ag. But think about this. If you're similar, and I hope you're much better. I'm not seeing the data from Kentucky. It'd be interesting to know how many people of the farm families in Kentucky have a transition plan. But if it's similar to Tennessee, think about this. Roughly, there's 15% of that $55.1 billion that have a plan for transitioning it to the next generation. what other industry would operate like that? What other industry would operate from that standpoint? This is quickly is, no matter what that farm family does, that farm will one day experience a transition. If they don't have a transition plan, it's still going to experience a transition. And the options typically are they can transfer ownership of assets if it addresses that in a will. They can have a transition plan so that viable farm business can be passed on, but often it's sale and divisions of assets, which typically is an end to that family farm operation, that legacy. Challenges and opportunities. One of the greatest challenges is to create and execute the transition plan. And it's interesting, we get comments back after master farm manager, and we'll talk about this just a little bit later, but I've had emails back that said, Dad would not discuss this. Dad would not discuss it. Dad recently passed. Mom says now we've got to start on some kind of a plan. So again, that's the greatest challenge facing these farm families. And when we go back to what's the priority, the priority should be the parents. Adequate retirement income for the parents is most likely that first priority. And a lot of times people don't understand how much it may cost them in their retirement. What about long-term care? Where's their income coming from? Social Security, pensions, savings, investments, the farm. Oh, is there any need adjusting for inflation? I used Steve's real estate evaluation graph, and then I added inflation a few years ago to my talks just to show people where we are. And look at this. Prior to 2021, the 20-year average inflation rate was 2.1%. The last 10 years, it's been 1.8%. The last 2 years reported, 21 was 7%, 22 is 6.5. It's interesting, you can read some of the media now and say inflation is cooling. I'd like for them to talk to my wife after she returns from a grocery store and quotes all the individual prices and how much they've increased. But the inflation rate that we're seeing now is comparable to when I was in college back at Knoxville in the late 80s. I recently went to retirement from a farm credit guy that had 42 years of experience in farm credit. He said, Kevin, we're fixing to see double-digit interest rates. Said we're going to see some short-term loans hit 10%, but it's nothing like what we saw back in the 80s when double-digit interest rates hit 20, 21, 22%. So the inflation can also impact what we're looking at from changes in transition. I'm going to jump to family living expenses quickly. There's some folks that kind of spend on family living expenses like that double rainbow and pot of golds, both on their farm or in their pocketbook. But I borrowed this information from University of Illinois. I know Kentucky has some data, but I wanted to show something with this, and I flipped the figures around. This is 2021 data, or 2012 through 2021, and I'm first showing in figure 2, look, non-farm income doesn't change much. Non-farm income doesn't change much. That's probably the spouse with the non-farm income. But look, and these are row crop farms. Is net farm income volatile? Yes, very much so. Tremendous volatility in their net farm income, but look over on the right, and did they adjust their family living expenses? No. So family living expenses can be tremendous. These estimates are well over $100,000. What's really interesting is Illinois says their increase was 12% from 2020 to 2021. Jerry Pearson, the Kentucky group, said the Kentucky increase was 28%. I'm really interested to see what 2021 to 2022 shared with family living. So family living, $100,000 plus or minus a lot. Again, going back to Dr. Cole, and I often ask the producers I work with, 35-year-old couple or 65-year-old couple, what's going to spend the most money on family living? Cole says the 65-year-old couple will, because 25% more, because they spend it on medical costs, travel, and grandchildren. I have these little math problem figured out if you want to know how much it's going to cost. We've got 2 people, 3 meals a day, $5 per person per meal for the year, 15 years, $164,000. If you splurge and spend $15 per couple per meal, you're going to have $250,000 to cover just the meals for the older generation during that time. Where do we start with this? It's awkward for the kids to initiate this conversation. We need to start with the parents. We need to start with the parents. Bring in a lender or financial advisor. Develop that transition team. It's not a one and done. We need to update it periodically, even if it's just beneficiaries. True story, height of COVID, working with an operation here with several employees, there had been a COVID death. Young lady passed away from COVID, been working with this operation for about 10 or 12 years, had been divorced, remarried, and when we looked up the beneficiaries of the life insurance, the ex-husband was still listed as the beneficiary. Things worked out, but it was pretty hectic the day that I made the visit. You need to have a transition team, and this is where everyone gets on board. You'll talk to folks that say the attorney is very helpful. Last night we had an accountant financial planner with us. The lender may push the group into more information regarding farm transition plan, and it may be an extension educator. We had a master farm manager session, and a lady called me afterwards and said, I'm a communication specialist and I do this a lot, working with farm families. You may want to hire an outside facilitator. The one thing, go off-site. Typically, this is not a kitchen table discussion, and it's certainly not a kitchen table discussion around Thanksgiving and Christmas or when somebody's having a birthday. But the one thing to do is to go off-site. I was working with, again, a young man that older generation had passed away, 2 brothers. One had aspirations to keep all the farm, and I was working with him on a farm plan. The other brother had no aspiration at all to come back to the farm. And I said, how do you all discuss this? He said, well, it's interesting. Said, brother comes in every so often. We're trying to work through this. I said, where do you have this discussion? He said, well, that's another interesting question. He said, we actually go 2 miles down the road to the church we grew up in. He said, we usually sit outside or sometimes we'll go inside and we have this discussion about what we're going to do and divide up this farm operation, because he said, sitting in that church property or on those church grounds, we tend to keep our emotions in check, and it works. And I thought, these 2 will probably work through this. This is the thing that we have to involve a team. I borrowed this again from my coworker. He goes through a chapter on estate planning tools. This is all the tools that are available. And the reason I said, if we talk about starting this conversation earlier, there's investments, life insurance, everything that can be looked at that may help us offset and be able to create some assets to pay for that sibling that doesn't want any part of the farming operation. Okay. Letter of last instructions can be very helpful. Burial prepayment insurance can be very helpful. How about disability long-term care? But all of these tools are the reason most farm families need to reach out to a team. Well, here's the one sometimes that I step on some toes, and I actually had a good friend of mine when I made this presentation last year come up to me and he said, you stepped on my toe, but I needed it. Working here does not necessarily qualify you to be the manager. I will say that I've heard some folks say that you need to go off and work somewhere else before you come back to the farm operation. I've heard people add, you need to go off, get a promotion, and then come back. But the other thing, don't protect the next generation from the current business problems or successes. Or has the next generation seen the books? Has the next generation seen the books? most of the time, my experience with this is when there's been somebody that's facing some financial difficulties. I've got multiple examples of where I've worked with the producer that's in their 50s, dad's in their 70s. We're facing foreclosure, and the one in their 50s has actually thought, oh, all I've been is hired labor during this entire time. They had no idea. If Dr. Cole doesn't ask it or describe it, ask him about his experience in Iowa. I believe it was in Iowa, somewhere in the Midwest, about has the next generation seen the books. Treat siblings and heir fairly, not necessarily equal. Equal may not be possible or desirable. You often hear people say, well, we had the 300-acre farm when we divided up 100 acres each. Was that equal? Probably not. The other thing we can encounter sometime is, how about that child that stayed on the farm? Help build the equity and net worth of that farm. Are they due a larger share if that farm is split up or it is divided? Most people will say yes. I was in West Tennessee when the gentleman actually stood up and said, I put a lot of sweat equity into that operation. You know, and there's some formulas out there that will say, and it is up to the parents, that that person or that child may deserve a 2-to-1 share or even a 3-to-1 share. I will ask, how were they compensated during the time? Because I've got one family that I work with that the farm is in a cooperation. The sibling there gets paid not only labor, but a management fee for managing that farm. Well, here's the other thing. When we get back to management, transferring that ownership is much better than much easier than transferring the management and leadership. I throw in a little beef cattle genetics. Management and leadership often have a low heritability coefficient. You know, leaders and managers are trained. That's the reason that I mentioned early on, we need to start this training very early with those youth and not just talk about, we want to teach them a strong work ethic. Let's say we're going to talk to them about managing and leading, you know, and here's the challenges. The older generation, they're reluctant to share management responsibilities, and the younger generation, they're reluctant to ask for more management responsibilities. You know, there's a lot of tasks that you can start involving the younger generation in training in that management responsibilities. And I'm kind of hurrying up to get finished to open up for some chat, but you know, why transition fails? There's a lot of things that the reason they fail. There's a lot of the unexpected events, untimely death, marriage, divorce, weather, economy that we have no control over. But most of the time, failure to communicate is the catalyst. Steve and I put together a little deal, and Steve mainly wrote it and shared it with me, and we looked about an opportunity or an obligation. I don't know if you've looked at that, but what happens when we have someone outside of agriculture, say they're in marketing and they go back to school and they want to be an attorney? We say they change careers. What about the young person that really doesn't want to farm, but they've been working on the farm and they decide to leave? How does the neighbors and the ag industry look at that individual? Oh, they left farming. They left and they disappointed their parents. They didn't want to stay on the farm. So again, it's back to a lot of those goals. I will share with you that for us, we have the Farmland Legacy Manual. You can just search for Tennessee Farmland Legacy. This entire manual is available online, divided up into several chapters, working with a professional, taking stock in your estate and some of the communications, but it's an excellent resource. One of the other resources we have is What My Family Should Know. This came from an attorney that we work with in Knoxville area. She's got about 40 years in as an estate attorney. They had it as a booklet for some time, but then they turned it into a fillable PDF. We actually will email that, and I can share that with Steve or anyone there. We have to include a disclaimer with that, but it's something that you can fill in even if someone is not getting into a transition plan. This little document helps so much if something unexpected happens and there is a death that we need to figure out everything to do about that operation. where are the accounts located? I do note that it asks for sensitive data. It asks for social security numbers and bank account numbers. It's optional where you put them in. You can actually, though, make sure if you do that, keep them in a secure location. We've had some A&R agents that actually print out the booklet and hand it out at some of our meetings. Couple of ending thoughts with my reminders, and this is some of the comments that I've made over the years. You know, avoid the desire to torture the data until it confesses the answer you want. You know, what are we talking about here? Be truthful, be honest. You know, we see this a lot now, even with media. You can take the same activity or the same event and it be totally presented differently because somebody tortured the data until it confessed the answer they want. And remove those rose-colored glasses and be realistic relative to your expectations and abilities. You know, you're not born into managing the operation, but make sure you learn how to manage the operation. And finally, in closing, just a few more friendly reminders. Communicate and plan with the family to develop today's best solution for your farm's legacy. It may change. Something may change next week, next month, that we need to go back and revisit it, but do it. There's no time like today to start. And what knowledge has not been transferred? What knowledge has not been transferred? Don't leave that burden of making decisions to the surviving spouse and the next generation. And, you know, finally, did anyone mention communication? You know, it's the key. How do we spur them on, the farm families, in communicating and doing this? You know, and I tell the farm families, talk to your kids, your spouse, your parents, your grandparents, talk to that advisory team and get started. I'll end with that. I'll also, if you would like, I can share a PDF of this presentation.
Kevin, we did have folks earlier asking about copies of the slides, and I said, well, if you don't, I can steal them. So, but yeah, we can certainly share those slides readily and that information. Guys, there's I lost my participant list. There's a relatively small number of participants. If anybody, if you want to type in a question in chat, you can. But Brett, I think we'd be okay with this number. If somebody wants to just verbalize a question, I think we can turn on and allow to talk, and you can just bring that in. So if you'd like to do that, Nicole, this looks like a lot of the same stuff. Some of the stuff that we talk about when we go out here and saying these things in Kentucky. I did drop into the chat situation I've just come across in the last couple of months, and it's a multi-sibling family, and they're wanting to develop a transition plan, and their idea was to not include the spouses. You know, we're just going to develop this, and then we're going to tell the spouses what. You know, I said, you know, if you have a meeting and you go home, what is the first thing the spouse is going to ask? You know, what went on in the meeting. So you might as well, there is no point in that. I see nothing to be gained by that. I mean, the siblings just wanted to sort of work it out among themselves and then I guess spring it on the rest of the family. And I just find that to be a very, very bad idea. So.
And I did not cover that, but you notice the bullet point said, don't neglect the spouses, and it may not be a priority for some. It was interesting, again, a few years ago, sitting down with a number of, there was 5 siblings involved. And there was 2 brothers not there. It was a large diversified operation. Well, there was 2 sisters and then a brother and then another lady sitting there. And again, another true story. It got off onto the 2 brothers that weren't there. And the discussion went toward the in-laws. Okay, so I'm just sitting there trying to think, okay, how can we kind of continue this or on? And I happened to look over to the other lady that was there with the brother. And she said, oh, don't look at me. She said, I'm just a crazy girlfriend. I'm not married yet.
We definitely see some good ones. Nicole, Kevin mentioned something there toward the end that I know you've talked a little bit about, and that is the importance of knowing where these, you know, our digital legacy. I think you raise a good point about that.
Yeah, I think so many great things. So I know that the slides will be helpful for everyone watching and kind of as that reference point of what are some of these tips that I need to pass along. And you shared some great references. But thinking about that, where do we keep all of that information? And there's so much, and not just the accounts, but also that knowledge transfer that you mentioned, Kevin. I think was just such a really good point. But what I like about the materials we have, the booklet that you shared, that it gets people thinking about what am I not thinking about, and what information do I need to write down? What are some of those? Because and this was in the chat as well, how overwhelming it is, and that's what I hear, and I know you hear Steve as well, as just how overwhelming it is, and so not knowing where to start and just and that's my encouragement. I know it is yours, Steve, with just start somewhere. And maybe that's gathering your information or having that first conversation. So just really, really great tips. I see why you guys make a good a partnership, because your information really, really complements one another.
Well, I'm not sure we went to the same church, but we sang from the same psalm book. So
I would share very good point that, and it is the manual that we have is available online, all available online, but it's actually divided into some chapters exactly the way you explained. First one is why succession planning. The second one is the family discussion. Then the third one is taking stock of your estate. Just exactly what you mentioned. And then we go into the business and organizational struggle, all the tools, acquiring professionals, things like that. So it's kind of that stepwise approach. Very good.
Yeah. And Nicole, of course, you have your series of publications that get at a lot of these. I think it's very useful. And Nicole, you made a really good point. I think looking through these materials can remind us of the things that we've left out. What have I forgotten? I need to include. So I think those are very, very useful. Kevin mentioned, and I know that as Nicole and I have been doing some of these sessions, we've been talking a good bit about that notion, Kevin, of opportunity or obligation. And I have come across some material of late, and I'm still trying to figure out how to get this in a usable format. But the American Psychological Association has a term called identity foreclosure, and we are experts at it in agriculture. And identity foreclosure is essentially, I've got it over here on another screen, the unquestioning acceptance by individuals of the roles, values, and goals that others have chosen for them. Individual commitment to the foreclosed identity occurs without exploring the value or contemplating alternative roles that might be more appropriate. Now, that's an APA sort of definition, paraphrased a bit, but we are experts at that. I mean, and I'm guilty as anybody else. We raise our kids from the very beginning, giving them tractors and Carhartts and boots, and we sort of expect them to be farmers. Now, identity foreclosure is the same thing that sometimes makes us Wildcat fans or Vol fans or Baptist or Methodist or Republicans or Democrats. We're raised that way. But I think the notion that we don't question that is where the problem arises, that there's just that unquestioning identity. So I am really pushing this notion, and about every third slide, Kevin, I have it down to bottom, opportunity or obligation, because I think that has that has created a lot of issues of people who were there because they felt like that was their responsibility. If it's an opportunity, it's great. If it's an obligation, then that's probably a problem. So. Okay, anybody else? Anybody want to jump in with a comment or question?
I actually have a question. Kevin, I appreciated that you mentioned that assembling a team and the need for assembling a team. And the folks we have on the call today, and the focus of this series is on professional development for extension agents, but also other ag professionals, ag service professionals that are doing similar work to parallel work to extension. And I think it would be helpful for me as you think back across times where there have been these types of folks have successfully provided support to producers on what are and how can some of those boundaries of what we are supposed to be doing versus not doing. I said, as a helping the producer pick the team or advising them on who should be on the team might be part of that. Any other particular roles for the folks on here as they think about what is and is not their responsibility?
Well, and that's a very good question. And to be quite honest, I got asked that question last night. And it's one of the challenges that we've had is, as I mentioned, and it's the reason when I send out the what my family should know, we have to put a disclaimer with it. We've actually really are asking now if we can get someone, an attorney on within our ag econ department. We had it years ago in Knoxville, but we're getting so many questions like this, and also on contracts. I didn't get into the issue that we're seeing with solar farms, which is also taking a lot of our farmland. Okay, but yes, what we tend to do is say, try to have someone. Over time, we find out attorneys or planners that we work with, and we tell them, you know, this is not an endorsement, but we know they've got experience working with agriculture. It's kind of like the same thing we do with taxes. You know, every person that's out there completing taxes doesn't know a lot about filling out a Schedule F, you know. So it's kind of the same information we have, but a very good point. And we try to find those folks, but it's what's interesting. You talk with some of the producers, some of them will tell you that it was the lender or the financial planner that pushed them. Mm-hmm. And then most of them also are confident with an attorney they're working with. So it kind of develops a team if you can just start that first step. That first step is very important.
Yeah, I'm the first to acknowledge it. Sometimes for us as an extension, particularly at the county level, it's difficult because people feel like we're getting in the middle of things. I think, Nicole, you and I have run across some folks that adjoining county agents have said, if you'll do this in your county, I'll do this in yours. So because you got to live with these folks. So it's a good issue. Kevin, thanks for bringing a lot of points up. We're at 1 o'clock. We want to keep these things on time. We'll remind you that on March the 23rd, we will have Dr. David Cole, professor emeritus from Virginia Tech, somebody Kevin and I have worked with a good bit. Dr. Cole's always entertaining. He takes a much more macro approach, I think, and I think you will enjoy interacting with him. So see if there's anything else in the chat. Yeah, good point, Nicole. So thank you guys very, very much. Again, we'll be back on March the 24th. Nicole, Brett, anything else you have? Kevin, as always, it's a pleasure to work with you. We just
Stay safe.
Okay. And so with that, we will sign out and see you on March the 21st. Thank you very much.
Yeah.